Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. For as little as $3 you can gain access to Patreon only episodes as well as access to our Discord server where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
In listening to this episode, I would like to clarify that this is not a position against medication per se, in that for people who are on medication who find it helpful, this is not trying to tell anybody to stop taking medication, and that any kind of medication advice should refer back to your trusted provider. This is a discussion about the larger systemic influences surrounding the medical and psychiatric industries and pharmaceutical industries, and not simply a position on medication. The desire that we seek is expansive care that helps people. And that means a lot of social and financial support and stability for everyone so that they are able to heal.
Today we're going to discuss an article in madinamerica.com, which will be in the show notes, which is addressing the recent news of a study which had reviewed decades of research saying that ultimately the chemical imbalance idea around serotonin and depression is a myth, that it's basically bunk.
Right.
Well, it's one of those things where to flat out say that it is completely bunk is a mystery.
I mean, it's just sort of my way of paraphrasing.
Yeah, I think it's an actual mystery of the research. But that's my point of view on it.
There's a key quote in this article. The cruelty of others is immeasurable and can never be underestimated, especially by those who say they care.
Yeah, well, I think that it is a fraud because from everything that I've read about the brain, everything that you do has an effect on your biochemistry. And so if you have a traumatic experience, it affects your biochemistry. That isn't the problem then, isn't the biochemistry. It's the trauma. And I think that big pharma is a fraud, particularly perpetrated in the United States, where we have about 4.4% of the world's population and use 66% of the world's psych drugs, and is the only country in the world where you can allow direct-to-consumer drug ads. And so I do think it's a fraud. Now, I do think that there is zero evidence that anyone is healed by drugs. Certainly people are numbed. Their symptoms are less because they are numbed. But that is not because they're restored to mental health. And that too, that drugs heal you, they cure you psychologically, is a fraud to sell drugs. And big pharma is the most profitable of all the pharmaceutical sales in the United States. And there's, and it's no accident that we who allow direct-to-consumer advertising and whose research is biased have found that in England, originally under Whitaker, who did the first study of thousands and thousands of mental health patients, could do so because that research was funded by the government of England with its public healthcare system. The United States funding is all done by the companies that are selling the products. There used to be in the United States. It's discontinued, an entirely volunteer run publication only for doctors called The Medical Letter. And they published only research not done by the companies that are selling the drug. But it's very hard to find now. And that was only for doctors, because obviously they have a vested interest in finding that what they're doing is successful so that they can sell more drugs. And I had a client who was a scientist working for a drug company and left because they didn't accept the negative data she was coming up with. So I think it is a fraud perpetrated by Big Pharma against people with distress.
Right. So in this study that they're referencing in this article, the study reviewed decades of research. The chemical imbalance myth was shown to have no support in scientific evidence. Now, if you were being conservative about this, you could still say that there's no scientific evidence yet, right? And so maybe, Ikoi, is this sort of your position on it all?
Well, I mean, for one, I guess it's one of those things where, like, the serotonin hypothesis in itself, right? The idea that depression is caused by low serotonin has kind of, it's a very oversimplified explanation that's been out of vogue even in psychiatry for over a decade. That's kind of the one of the major aspects of these things is that, like, what is understood colloquially in the population and what's been going on in terms of the research end of things have lagged quite a bit. So the fact that, like, the serotonin theory is an extremely oversimplified theory that doesn't even that most psychiatrists wouldn't necessarily say, oh no, it's just low serotonin. Like they wouldn't describe depression that way anymore, even in a lot of practices. So it's one of those things where...
Can I riff off this for a second?
Sure.
So it's ultimately difficult to know who to trust.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? So I've been reading this book recently, Dopamine Nation, and sort of this idea of the chemical imbalance. Actually, as a side, I think the chemical imbalance, to my mind, is still very prevalent. I remember talking to a friend about this whole thing, and she told me with much authority that the depression was very much a chemical imbalance. And I was trying to suggest, I think it's a lot more sort of environmental and everything. And she just obviously thought I was being silly or a hippie or something like that. So, it is a huge part of the zeitgeist. I think it has entered into most people's lives. There's some sort of basic understanding of that idea, and that's not great if it's
right,
totally wrong.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, again, like most things about, kind of complicated matters, it is in terms of like public consumption, compartmentalized into overly reductive and simplified narratives that ultimately most often does not serve to further understanding of the subject. Like that's just a common issue that we have regarding complex topics in the public sphere, right? We also have this issue, right?
Yeah, I understand too, but I also understand that in the research, the drugs that were administered for depression were only as effective as sugar pills 75% of the time. And the other 25, they might have helped with severely depressed people, but they couldn't really separate that from the Hawthorne effect, which is that if you expect to be made better, you may temporarily be made better. And the results were temporary. And there's huge research on that. And yet those pills are marketed wildly and widely. And even in the United States, the National Institutes of Mental Health put out a statement that said the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and the drugs associated with it ignore etiology. They ignore, how did you get depressed? What was the matter? And
Right.
that
Oh,
is
absolutely.
false.
That's part
But
of
they
like
don't
the
have an advertising budget, and therefore that voice was drowned. So this is directly tied to a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry that bribes psychiatrists and faculty outrageously. The case of Biederman is the most wonderful illustration. Biederman was the head of the Yale Child Psychiatry Department. I'm sorry, the Harvard Child Psychiatry Department, and also the Child Psychiatry Association of the United States. He wrote that the drug Zyprexa for schizophrenic adults could really help children with mental health problems. For that, he got a $3.4 million and a big donation for a research wing at Harvard for himself. Okay, it turns out Zyprexa administered to children causes diabetes and doesn't do a thing to help their mental health problems. It just ruins them physically through acute diabetes. And
Right.
in an interview with his assistant, I was impressed to hear his assistant talk when they asked this doctor, how could you suggest that Zyprexa is good for children when it caused untold suffering? And in a moment of uncharacteristic honesty, his assistant laughed and said, hey, because they were fined, they got the biggest fine in history, over $1 million. He said, hey, when you're racing towards $1 billion, you pay the traffic ticket. In other words, if it's found out that you've destroyed the lives of thousands of children, so you're fined. It doesn't measure up to the profits you make.
I mean, that's kind of the entire like it's not restricted to like mental health medications, though. You know, the issues with the pharmaceutical industry and how they operate, in many ways, is, you know, has severe limitations. You know, against against patient health, right? So it's, you know, so absolutely, I do agree that, you know, a lot of the pharmaceutical practices are contraindicated in many ways to looking at human health in contextual ways.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely.
That, you know, whether medical, whether psychiatric, whether psychological, you know, the way
Absolutely.
that we look at, you know, problems is an extremely compartmentalized, and underneath the compartmentalization, a profit-driven system.
Exactly. And a medical system that is market driven will not serve people. And since our field is the psychological field, we're looking there. But I totally agree with you. It's omnipresent. Doctors are bribed. The least a doctor gets is $30,000 a year for having occasional seminars with colleagues, with a drug representative present serving the wine and cheese, where they tout the marvels of whatever drug they're being paid to hustle. And if you say anything critical, you're off the gravy train. Minimum is 30 grand a year. This is a corruption of the entire healthcare system, not just mental health. I totally agree with you. But since this is our field, we're looking at the bogus claims of healing through drugs that don't heal, of problems not having anything to do with the society, including the social environment of a family, going on to the fact that American society is crumbling, and just locating it as a chemical imbalance to be corrected by chemicals, blames the individual, excises any social responsibility, and fails. Even according to the American Institutes of Mental Health, And that institute doesn't have an advertising budget, so you'd have to look it up to see National Institutes of Mental Health and see what they say about it.
So in the article, these psychiatric survivors, they talk about this chemical imbalance myth as a form of social control. Now, do you actually think that's on purpose, or is that just a byproduct?
I think it's a byproduct. I think profit is the purpose. Profit is the be-all and end-all of capitalism. To compete, you get ahead, you make more money. And I don't think they care about the consequences. And we have to, because the consequences are very severe.
Well, the consequences are felt, the burden of the consequences are burdens people, right? Rather than, so that's why it's important to address these issues. I think there is a definite profit motive, but there's also kind of, the general way of how our capitalist system deals with any kind of these very complex issues is, again, like compartmentalization, and not just compartmentalization, but expedience.
Yes, and excising social and political and economic forces to make the problems all in your head. Bad choices. That's why you're being evicted. Hello. There are huge economic and social costs. We had Dawn Martinez on our program, It's Not Just in Your Head, who was an editor of the wonderful collection of the theory, a socially informed theory of mental illness, where she saw individuals in the middle of a triangle. And one side of the triangle was personal, another side was economic, and the third was political. And a person is subject to all of these forces rather than just they have some chemical imbalance that has nothing to do with the failures of society. And that's indirectly a political issue. However, I don't think politics informs the drug companies. I think they're driven by profit, and they don't care what they do to people as long as their responsibility to their shareholders of producing more profit is met. And that is inhumane to have a market-driven healthcare system.
Right. It's a profit-motivated political system,
Yes,
right?
Totally.
It's not so much that politics influences, these companies, but more that these companies have an undue influence on policy and politics that end up, impacting people's lives in many ways, So yeah, absolutely. I mean, specific to, psychiatric medications, right? Like, even if they are effective, right? Putting people in distressed environments where they are unable to rest and heal limits the benefit of any medications.
Well, that's of course true. However, from everything I've read, and I really read up on this and did programs on it, the effectiveness is to numb and pacify and actually depress the mental activities of the patients.
Yeah, and I think that's why many people, including these people in the article, feel like it is a form of social control.
It can be inadvertently, absolutely it is. And that 1 in 5 adults in the United States is on one of these psych meds, and 1 in 10 children is on them, really means that they will be less active and they'll have much less energy. It's particularly illustrated in the question of Ritalin, which is given for hyperactivity disorder in children. And some schools require that children are drugged with Ritalin in order to attend school. But it turns out there was an expose that Ritalin is a medication that is like speed. and that this is a direct, it was exposed and they paid a big fine as a direct profit-making hoax. And that is serious.
Yeah, it's very interesting because if you are a psychiatrist, then it must be a very uncomfortable position to be in, because to what degree, is your profession responsible for legitimizing this false idea? They're supposed to be sort of trusted professionals, and their profession lends legitimacy. But from conversations we've had on here, it's obvious, like, if you've only got 15 minutes with a patient, like...
Exactly, yeah. Because they used to be paid at least 4 times as much. But once they go on some kind of a managed care, they only get a quarter as much. So they give people 15 minutes and write their meds and get the whole fee that way, 4 times as much as they get for the 15 minutes. And so, it's a profit-motivated decision that has nothing to do with helping people. And people are abandoned by the psychiatric community. There's a book by Davies, who's a psychiatrist, called Cracked, that very carefully researches and reports on this. And it's all, the opposite evidence is everywhere if you know where to look, and most patients don't.
Well, this is why ultimately this article, these authors find it difficult to trust, because this idea, the chemical imbalance myth, has bled out into some sort of folk wisdom, and then your family and friends believe in it, and then that just becomes like an extra layer of poison, right?
It does, because it's part of the culture, and people are acculturated into that lie. Remember, we had a woman named Higgins on, who wrote about her comeback from schizophrenia in her wonderful book. They were plying her with medication. She just had to understand what she'd been through so that she could come back. But had she listened to the psychiatric establishment, she would have been numbed and dumbed for the rest of her life. This way she wasn't. It's terribly destructive, this fraud for profit. At any rate, I have a client now who was diagnosed schizophrenic because his father woke him up in the middle of the night. He had been going through a bad period because he broke up with his girlfriend. He had been smoking pot, and like almost everybody else in his age cohort. And his father woke him, and he was in the middle of a nightmare, and he punched a hole in the wall, after which his parents called an ambulance, had him hauled off to a hospital where he said, "There's nothing wrong with me. I was just pissed." So that he was labeled in denial and as a schizophrenic. And he said, "I'm not going to take your pills." So they gave him an injection against his will. And he's diagnosed now as schizophrenic, having to take these injections. He is getting off of the medication and doing really quite well. But those horror stories are routine. It's a terrible thing, just for blind profit. You pay the traffic ticket when you're fined, as Biederman's assistant said. But you do such damage.
Right, yeah, I realized I mentioned the Dopamine Nation book earlier, so I just want to return to that point because I think it's worth finishing. I'm wondering sort of what the next thing will be that gets pedals. I mean, if there's any intuitions, feel free to share them, but in this book, Dopamine Nation, she talks about, rather than a chemical imbalance, she has these illustrations of a seesaw with pain on one side and pleasure on the other side. And
but the pain-pleasure hypothesis is also a chemical imbalance hypothesis. Those are very closely related.
Yes, they are.
Right. And this is part of the book where I felt like, are they trying to slip something under the radar here? That instead of a chemical imbalance, you have this plain pain-pleasure balance. As you said, it sort of relates to chemicals, or an idea like that. But, it's an interesting book. I just felt like, is this just redressing the chemical imbalance thing in new clothes?
It is. They are constant. They're very inventive. They have excellent high-paid minds working on how to capture a market share through an imaginative mechanism of justifying what they're currently doing, selling drugs. And then they have another huge marketing enterprise inducing psychiatrists for money to tout this to their colleagues, writing articles and getting prestigious psychiatrists to sign them for money, and so on. It's a true racket, and they're making a lot of money at everyone's expense here.
Ikoi, I just wondered, I don't know if we've necessarily covered enough about sort of your perspectives on this, or maybe the potential maybe dangers of, I don't know, that maybe there's a sort of stigma attached to meds or stuff like that. And yeah, just, penny for your thoughts.
This is my main concern, working with mostly lower income clients, myself being a lower income person, and most of my friends, kind of hanging on the baseline of survival, right? Is that I think, because a lot of my friends are dependent on their medications to function and to be able to get to their jobs. And they do not have, and they cannot expect any kind of social, financial support coming from the state or in any way in the near term, right? And so it's one of those things where I am always extremely. I think there is a difference between talking about systemic issues of the pharmaceutical industry and also necessarily demonizing medication. And I feel the latter is extremely unproductive. This is one of the reasons why, do I actually like amphetamines or methamphetamines or heroin or any of those? There's a reason that I'm for the legalization of those drugs.
Me too.
Right? Because people need options to survive right now.
Yes, they do. They're in a terrible state. And one of the options is joining with other people to change it, which is very empowering, and why so many Americans are now joining unions.
Right.
But
I mean, it is, and I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. But that doesn't necessarily address, like a lot of my friends with, a lot of mental health issues often find those environments really stressful.
yes,
And don't stay in those environments very long because it's beyond their ability of working full time and trying to take care of their own life and be politically active on top of them. And if you ask any of them, they say take away my medication and all of that falls apart and I become homeless.
Well, part of it is you're in a caring profession, and the United States utterly devalues caring. It's not practical.
Absolutely, because it's not profitable at all to care for people. So again, ultimately, I don't believe that mental health is only environmental. That I think there may be biological and genetic components. Right. Because we know very little about the brain. In fact, we know very little about the body in many ways. So I don't necessarily want to throw out the baby with the bathwater because, we are still learning about a lot of things. It's just that we know that the pharmaceutical industry generally takes the most expedient and profitable form of action, right? Rather than the most patient beneficial form of action. And for me, the most important thing that I always stress to people is that, regardless of how people feel about medication, that not providing social care to people is failing them and making whatever medication, whether it's, physical medication, right? Like if somebody's diabetic and they have to work 3 jobs and they don't have Right, even if you are not like the type 1 or insulin dependent diabetics, right? A lot of diabetics, would like to be able to work shorter shifts, actually cook their meals or make healthier choices,
Mm-hmm.
right? But because of their work and financial status, they are unable to make those lifestyle changes that are necessary for their health.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to this point. There's this element in the article where it's just sort of talking about what happens to your identity around ideas of chemical imbalance, or when it stops being seen as true. As far as your friends are concerned, it doesn't matter what the theories are or what's true or what's untrue. They take the meds and they function, and everything works in that sense. But I do wonder when a piece of news like this drops, what happens? Does that percolate into culture, into society, and then how do people think of themselves? I imagine the consequences of it might be quite vast in terms of having this way of thinking about yourself and then that not actually turning out to be true at all.
No, I think people are not blaming their chemical imbalance. They might look for other things that hold them back and not feel that they are just a chemical weirdo. And then they might start thinking, well, how did I get here? Because the way to health is to figure, how did I get here? And how can I find my way out? Kind of like Hansel and Gretel in the woods. And experiencing those things they couldn't experience because they were too painful, so painful they threatened survival, and working them through, as in therapy, group therapy, and so on, which are luxuries in the United States and shouldn't be, because they should be part of a basic free healthcare plan we don't have. But I think it makes people feel like they are biologically some kind of sicko.
Well, also, any past conflicts someone might have had with a psychiatrist that might get them labeled as being sort of a problematic patient, in regards to depression and chemical imbalance. Like, in retrospect, maybe this person wasn't being difficult, they were just being a human being. But yeah, I don't know, Ikoi, your friends, clients gone through this process. Is there sort of any conceptualizing of it, the chemical imbalance stuff, or is it just literally about survival?
Well, I mean, I think almost all of them don't necessarily buy the simple, like, I am only chemical imbalance. That's a lot more actually prevalent in the middle class and higher tier, actually. That's where I think, that's the most dominant, because, people in that tier kind of understand, at least their lives may be very, very stressful, right? Because living under capitalism is stressful in general. But, their basic survival needs are met. A lot of, especially when people do come from, like, stable families, where they have relatively good relationships with their parents and their siblings and extended families. And, they still have, depression and anxiety and whatnot when, they have a decent marriage, they've got decent friends, they've got a decent job. It's a lot more easier to point to, hey, like, I've got this chemical imbalance problem, right? The people that have had to struggle with survival for a long time do generally, don't necessarily like simply think of themselves as chemically imbalanced. Again, I think that's one of the ways of how a lot of, like, the middle class culturally dominates the conversation. That doesn't necessarily reflect what, people are feeling in various sectors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that the experience of the wealthy is written about, or at least the well-to-do, and the vast mass of struggling people, because you have to remember, about half of Americans don't even have $500 in case of an acute emergency and are living desperately paycheck to paycheck. So they don't have access to other means. But all the medications that I know of do for them is numb them. And that's not the same as healing, of course. Nobody's cured from it.
No,
So
I mean, and to a certain degree, one of the issues is also that, a lot of people do not trust therapists as much as they distrust psychiatrists, right? That there is an equal amount of distrust.
yes, there is, and there's an equal amount of therapists that suck at their jobs, just like plumbers or psychiatrists or dentists or anybody else. There isn't the kind of, as American society breaks down, the devotion to do well by people in your job also breaks down. So when you find someone conscientious and not just interested in taking the money and running in any field, you're very lucky. And that's true of plumbers or electricians or psychiatrists or therapists. And we have to face that. There's a lot of rip-off people around, and it's very rare to find someone conscientious and committed.
Right. So it's in this kind of environment, I don't necessarily blame, some of the people that I know where, their approach is, I would rather have the drugs than have to talk to any of you people ever in my life again.
Yeah. Well, I can see that, just like there are people who won't take the COVID vaccines, even though US has the most COVID dead in the entire world, even though we're only about 5% of the population at most, because they don't trust the pharmaceutical establishment and they don't trust the government. And so that's why we're dying.
Yeah, what happens to a culture that just doesn't trust anything? Because I just imagine everything must fall apart at that point. All cooperation goes out the window. When trust has just sort of been vacuumed out of a culture, surely that's like the end.
Well, I don't think it's that people don't trust. It's just that we have a polarization of because the people that don't trust pharmaceutical industries or the state still have trusted figures.
Like Donald
Right, whether
Trump.
whether that's religion or whether that's various other things. Could be Donald Trump, could be their church, could but what we have is kind of a polarization of two people warring in the defense of their trusted authorities, right?
That's true. There's people who trust Donald Trump and who trust that whatever he says is true in spite of the evidence, and people who distrust Donald Trump and think whatever he says is false and trust the government or Dr. Fauci around injections. It's
Right.
right
And there are people that don't trust Donald Trump and that don't trust the government either that may have.
exactly.
Right. It's so I mean, it's very rare that people don't trust anyone at all. They usually have some kind of figure that they trust. It's just that, generally, our institutional trust has been degraded greatly.
Yes, and I think people look then to something they can trust,
Right.
whether it's objectively trustworthy or not, because they're
Right.
desperate. Or they fall apart, that's why the United States has a mental health crisis. A lot of people are falling apart. And trust is one of the basic 10 things that make a society healthy.
Yeah, and presumably a key part of recovery and or sort of general day-to-day health is that, you can rely on other people and you can trust them and they can trust you, etc.
Exactly, because we're social animals. We need each other. And that's why distrust is a terrible, terrible thing among human beings. I look at mass murder. Every day, there's a mass murder in the United States. Only the big ones now get in the newspaper because it's so routine. Then a big one, they don't even define mass murder as anything but 4 people killed, shot and killed by a stranger. And there are more than one a day in the US. And people react with personal solutions. They get the omnipresent bulletproof book packs for their children. They don't go in public places. They're always afraid. And they instill that fear into their children. But those are all personal decisions. They're not social. The social protection isn't there. The Supreme Court just allowed concealed carry, people to conceal guns and take them everywhere. New York is trying to fight that by not allowing your gun on the subway or the buses or in certain areas, but they won't know if you've got a gun or not because it could be concealed. So people are individually scared because they've been looking for individual solutions. Other countries do it differently. Like New Zealand had one mass shooting that was terribly frightening. Jacinda Ardern, the socialist labor candidate, they were killing Muslims. So she wore a headscarf and said, "We're all one people." And they banned private guns. And people supported her in that. But we don't have anything like that, anything like a social response. And the NRA and the big corporations, once again, capitalism rears its ugly head, that the gun corporations continue to buy the legislators who don't protect us.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the idea of, a lack of trust or betrayal. Not only were you lied to, which is something that then became a cultural meme, that also, people have taken their lives based off ideas like this one, believing they're inherently messed up, they have a chemical imbalance, it's all their fault, etc. So even if you weren't, personally ever taking meds for depression, I'm sure that you have family or friends that have. It's just, and potentially based off bad ideas. So there's just a lot of suffering. So how does the psychiatric profession respond to something like this? I mean, even on a consumer level, how many successful books have been published around this idea of the chemical imbalance theory, and how many people are responsible for sort of cultivating this culture around this idea? And
well, I mean, and again, it comes down to kind of like the compartmentalization of there is a certain well-meaning aspect to the medicalization model in that it is trying to link a mind-body connection a little bit more in some ways, but ultimately a capitalism always warps any positives from any kind of understanding into like simplified expedience, right? Because the capitalist state is not about, a holistic approach to anything, but like, here are the crumbs, here is the bare minimum that you will get. Take this and shut the fuck up.
Right. It's just also, it is all around profit, which buys, it makes the best democracies money can buy. And healthcare is a bought and sold item here. And I think people do feel betrayed and abandoned because they don't have anyone to trust to keep them even minimally healthy. And this is really terribly unsettling and painful and drives people mad. And there's all something that doesn't cure them.
Right. I mean, even if you don't necessarily stick to just the mental health, like you see this in a lot of, kind of like, surrounding conditions, right? Whether you're a chronic pain patient, whether you have autoimmune disorders or rare disorders, the latest one being like long COVID. People are kind of, basically like, a lot of medicine often abandons people simply because it is an expedience model. It is part of the model, right? That if you don't fit, like if the standardized treatment does not work for you, we would rather not try and figure you out and be creative and try things, because that's also a liability risk.
Right. Because
Everything is a liability in the capitalist state, right? And so it's like this. It's a house of layers of layers of layers of issues to create this like humongous problem to human health, right? Like the fact that there is no rainwater that is safe to drink because of forever chemicals,
right.
I am not someone that's usually surprised by bad news, but that did take me back a little bit. So it's because I mean, what we eat about a credit card's worth of microplastics every few months or something like that. I mean, all these things, about our environment, about our social environment, about our political environment, about our civil society, about our production and how we produce. Like these are all linked, and it's really, really unfortunate to live in this compartmentalized world where nothing matters but profit.
Yeah, and where people have liberated themselves, they have united these disparate movements of people who have suffered terribly and who suffer terribly, which is the mass of people, into a political movement for all people, like in France under Mélenchon. He united the communists, the socialists, the indigenous people, the Black people in protest against racism, women in protest against sexism, transsexuals, homosexuals, and so on in protest against discrimination against them, climate activists to say, we all are in it together, we all support each other, we need an alternative to capitalist exploitation. And those countries have more hope because they have a unified movement. And in the US, there's a kind of beginning of that class awareness in the absolute boom in union organizations that say we're all in this together. We need a decent standard of living for all of us. And they've been very, very successful. Chipotle just won $24 an hour beginning salaries. And the Amazon labor union certainly shook up the Amazon workers, and Starbucks has 200 Starbucks that are now organized, and they're organized overwhelmingly by the young women who work there. But there is an awareness that we all need each other that's showing up in the union movement, but we don't yet have a politically unifying, sensible movement the way they have in France, the way they had and in Colombia, in South America, which is why they just won the first left government they've ever had, or Chile, where they won, but all based on that kind of unity. And I think that's what we need, because then we could have an organization that all of us could trust. And so we wouldn't feel so lonely and betrayed.
And I think just to sort of end on a positive, there is a very good movie on Amazon Prime, lol, great company, called 13 Lives. And it's about the rescue of some Thai children who got stuck in this cave. And whilst maybe it's cheeseball or something to talk about a movie, but it's just kind of powerful because it's about, there's 5,000 people ultimately were involved in trying to save these kids. And as far as that, I mean, I don't know the maths of it, the accounts of doing it all, but I don't think the Thai state was necessarily concerned about money. I don't know.
Right. They were rescuing these children.
Yeah, I guess the dystopian question is, do things have to get really bad before good things happen?
Yeah, well, I do think they are pretty bad now. And there are very hopeful signs where there's a flood, where there's a snowstorm in the United States. People generally help one another out. They generally do. And because there is something when we recognize we're in it together, and that's hopeful. But what you need is an organization that represents that, so you know where to go, or you have some trust that you'll be represented. I think it's very symbolically important that the vice president of Colombia is a Black woman who worked as a house cleaner before and who's an excellent political leader who was recognized, because it basically says, whatever prestige or money you had in your job, we care about your activities for the collective. That's what's important here. And I think that message would have to be conveyed in a socially class-striated society, which Ikoi illustrated very well. That you really need that. And an issue like saving kids from a cave is not politically charged. So you won't have a whole funded opposition. Let's not fund those kids. It's not good for profit. No. It's a sort of safe way to be collective. And we'd have to help people feel safe in a collective effort in the UK and the US.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.